Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Douglas, Editor-in-Chief of ARTnews, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this special event, which is part of the Sotheby's Art Voices event series organized in partnership with Intelligence Squared. Today, we're going to be looking at the symbolism of flags in modern and contemporary art, with a special focus on flags on 57th Street, Winter 1918, a painting by the artist Childe Hassam, which is going on sale at Sotheby's on May 12th. Hassam was a leading proponent of Impressionism in America, and his series of flag paintings are remarkable examples of the movement, depicting New York in vibrant colors and light. We will also be discussing key examples of the flag in other works of modern art, from Jasper Johns right up to today, with a look at last year's unFlagging exhibition at Ballroom Marfa. I'm thrilled to have with me three brilliant guests to speak about this topic. Joining us from Wake Forest University in North Carolina is David Lubin, art historian and co-curator of the exhibition World War I and American Art for the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, which featured flags on 57th Street, Winter 1918. Welcome, David.
Hello, Sarah, and greetings, everyone.
And joining us from Marfa, Texas, we have Daisy Nam, curator of the unFlagging exhibition at Ballroom Marfa. Welcome, Daisy.
Hi, everyone.
And lastly, we have Elizabeth Pisano, Sotheby's Senior American Art Specialist, who is in New York, as am I. Say hello, Elizabeth.
Hi, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Thank you.
So this event is going to run for about an hour. Towards the end, we'll be taking your questions, which you can start submitting now. Underneath the video screen, you'll see a web form where you can enter your name and your question. To submit your question, please enter your details in the respective box and click Submit. So let's begin by exploring the history behind flags on 57th Street, Winter 1918. David, can you give us a little background on Hassam, as well as the context surrounding the painting?
Sure. Childe Hassam was from New England. He was basically from Boston and started his career as a book illustrator. And he was very not an academically trained artist, but very academic in his style. And then in the mid-1880s, he went to Paris and he became besotted with French Impressionism. And that was sort of the cause of his life, was to return to America and further the Impressionist tradition. And he's doing that at a time when Impressionism was already passé in France, but he revitalizes it and makes it strong and brilliant in America. He was part of a group of Impressionist painters called the 10. He was also very much an American patriot. And when America was debating whether or not to intervene in the Great War in Europe, he was adamantly in favor of intervention because he was of English heritage and very committed to French way of life. And so he wanted to do everything he could to help motivate Americans to make the decision to intervene in the war. And the flag series was part of that effort on his part. We've got a time delay here, time lag. There we go. So this is one of the paintings in the series. He painted approximately 30 flag paintings that showed New York at different times of day, different seasons of the year, in different lighting conditions, very much an Impressionist agenda of showing modern life in a modern style. And this painting is one of his most beautiful and actually quite different from most of the rest because it's very narrow and confined in what it shows. I think it's one of the 30, only 2 or 3 or 4 of them show no sky whatsoever. Here, we're looking at 57th Street toward 6th Avenue. And what you see in the upper sort of horizontal region of the painting is the elevated tracks that the 6th Avenue transit system used to have in those days. It was elevated. And I'll talk about the painting more later, but I think you want to move on.
Well, here we're looking at, I believe, a Preparedness Day parade in New York. Tell us a little bit about these parades and the sort of nationalistic aspect of this, David.
Well, in 1916, when the war had been going on for nearly 2 years, America was really violently divided between the people who wanted to intervene on the side of the Allies, the British and the French and the Belgians, later the Italians, and the people who wanted to stay out of the war. The people who wanted to stay out of the war were the pacifists, of course, and socialists in general, but also Irish Americans who didn't want to help the British, and German Americans. And German Americans were the largest ethnic group in America at that time. And so there were many, many German American who felt very much that America should not enter the war on the side of the Allies. So Hassan and a lot of his high-powered friends sort of organized a series of parades throughout the country in 1916 to say, we're going to go to war. Eventually, it's inevitable we go to war. America should start preparing now for the war by building up troop levels and armament levels. And so when Hassan saw the parade in New York, this is a photo of the parade, an aerial perspective of the parade. He was so stirred by all the American flags he saw draped from the buildings. This is a perfect motif to do a series of paintings of. Yeah, and then in July of 1916, a few months later, there was another huge parade in New York, and Hassan normally painted Fifth Avenue. That was usually the subject of his paintings, but not always. And here he shows the skyscrapers of New York so adorned, so bedecked with flags that the flag almost overwhelms the city or has taken on the city.
Sorry,
I would just add that I want you to notice that even though there are the flags on either side that are sort of, I'm straitjacketing the painting, there's voluptuous sky. It reminds me of a John Ford movie, this huge billowing cumulus clouds and the wonderfully light blue sky. So it really gives a sense that I think Americans felt, that Hassan felt, that America is the land of infinite possibilities, and we were needed over in France to extend those open horizons to a country that was very beleaguered by the German invasion. Sarah.
Now, David, the flag was a potent symbol in other art during the period, used as both propaganda and also in satire. Can you tell us about its representation during the war? And I'll also say that that open sky is an interesting kind of preview of what Daisy will be telling us in a little bit. So a nice foreshadowing there. Good. Go ahead, David.
Well, the Pledge of Allegiance, I pledge allegiance to the flag, had been created back in the 1890s. And from the 1890s right up to World War I, there were many people who felt the best way they could express their differences with the United States was to burn the flag or destroy the flag. And so there were many efforts to have a flag protection bill passed through Congress, and that wavered back and forth. But by the time the war came, the flag was just the most highly loaded symbol. So on the left, we have a popular poster, Support the Red Cross poster, showing a beautiful young Lady Liberty shrouded or covered in the American flag. She's draped in the flag. And on the other, we have an image from The Masses, which was the leading left-wing socialist magazine, that shows a clergyman, a politician, and a businessman wrapping themselves in the flag as they trod upon the bodies of dead Europeans. And the comment here, this was 1916, like very shortly after the Preparedness Day March. The theme of the illustration is to say, don't use patriotism as an excuse for imperialism and commercial profit-making, profiteering. So the flag, I think it's important to understand historically that by the time Hassan started painting the flag in 1916, it was already an extremely controversial symbol of America among Americans.
Now, turning back to Hassan himself and his work, Hassan painted some 30 works containing flags, one of which, The Avenue in the Rain, actually hangs in the Oval Office. David, why did Hassan return again and again to the flag? And what do you see as the other standout pieces from his flag series, apart from flags on 57th Street? Well,
as I mentioned earlier, Hassan spent his formative years learning to paint in Paris, and he was very taken with French Impressionism. More than anyone, he was an advocate of Monet's serial paintings. And what Monet would do, and other Impressionists did this, but particularly Monet, would use the same motif over and over again under different lighting conditions. And so Hassan borrows this technique and takes it back to America. And so he's looking for some subject that he can repeatedly portray. Monet had portrayed Rouen Cathedral over and over again. Hassan took a New England church and painted it over and over again. But the flag was really the perfect object for this, because the flag reflects light and is transparent to light. And I think maybe Daisy will talk about this later. The flag is so connected with the sky. So it made it a perfect, for Hassan, a perfect formless vehicle for his artistic explorations. At the same time, it conveyed his feelings about the importance of democracy and making, to use Wilson's term, making the world safe for democracy. Now, about the one that's in the White House, we could look at that. The
early morning on the Avenue.
No.
The Avenue in the Rain. The Avenue in the Rain. Of course, yeah. We have it right here.
You see how it's the only one of the paintings that's in the rain that just shows there's almost no differentiation between rain and brush strokes. It's an oil painting that looks like a watercolor. Everything is just sort of running down and reflecting. You see the pavement of the street beneath the flags, reflecting the flags. So a little bit like a film noir from 30 years later, showing the city in the rain. And this is, and the painting itself, if you look at its tall, sort of narrow format, it's like a flag itself. The painting is itself a flag. This was given to the White House in 1963 during the Kennedy years. And Kennedy particularly loved this. And it later was moved into the Oval Office, where it has been for several presidencies and can often be seen in the background of photos of the president. So even there, it's associating Americans with art in the past and the American flag in a very visually enhancing way.
I mean, we could talk about this painting forever. What strikes me about it is there's some similarities, at least in my opinion, to Monet's water lilies in the way that you see things almost dissolving into pure abstraction in the lower register of the painting. Let's look at Early Morning on the Avenue in May 1917. Can you tell me a little bit about this very different painting with flags?
Yeah, well, America entered the war in April of 1917, and by a month later, the city was still bestrewn with flags now of the Allied nations, not just of America, but so there's Britain and France and Belgium also represented. And he's showing us a corner of St. Thomas Cathedral at 53rd Street and Fifth Avenue with female pedestrians, mostly female pedestrians, walking up and down the street. And then this infinite horizon back toward, up the avenue toward Central Park. So again, there's this sense of a conflation of the church, femininity, open skies, nature, this bustling city, and overarching all that, the flags of the different nations. So it's a very expansive, open, panoramic view that I think conveys not only Hassan's, but also Americans in general, exuberance and excitement about entering the war. There was a feeling that we can really change the world for the better, and we're going to do it. And our troops are going to get in there and finish up quickly and be home, if not by Christmas, soon after Christmas.
And David, I love this painting too, because for anyone who knows Midtown Manhattan, of course, if you go further to the left, there's MoMA right there. Not then, but eventually. But let's go back to the painting that really is the subject of our conversation here. Flags on 57th Street, winter 1918, really stands out among the series. David, what makes it so special?
Well, I would give you a few things. First, let me give you the historical context. The winter of 1918, January, February of 1918, was one of the coldest, if not the coldest winter on record in the Northeast. And many people were suffering hardships and privation during that winter. And in fact, now they didn't know this at the time, but it's when the flu epidemic began. The pandemic started with first reported cases were in that winter of 1918. Meanwhile, over in France, the American troops had bogged down. They were in their trenches in bad weather, not moving forward, not crossing the line. And so I think Hassan, like many Americans, was feeling a sort of frustration at the stagnation and the intensity of that winter. So he paints a painting from his studio window on 57th Street, looking up the road towards 6th Avenue, toward the elevated that you see. And it's one of the only one in the series that has no sky available, no openness, as we were describing in those earlier images. Yeah, you look at these two images in comparison, you see the just hopefulness and excitement and exuberance of the 4th of July painting. And then, half a year later, things seem much more constricted. Now, I'm not saying this is it's a brilliant painting. It's almost like chamber music compared to the symphonic crashing drums of the 4th of July painting. There's an intimacy here, but still you have all this traffic kind of bottled up by the snow. In the lower foreground, you see one vehicle with its headlights on that's cutting loose, but up the canvas, everything else is kind of congealed. And the pedestrians on the road have on the sidewalk, it's a very icy, slick sidewalk. And there's a sense to me that they're almost in a trench and they're not going anywhere. And there's a kind of tightness there. And of the 3 flags you can see, 2 of them are dark and snow covered. And the upper one is catching late afternoon light from the sun, from sky we can't see, but there at the top you see the rooftop of a building. That's really the only place in the painting where light is falling in a direct way, and it's on that rooftop and on that flag. So, and I think I maybe mentioned it's the only one in the series that was done in winter. So it is unique in the series.
It's amazing to me, David. This painting is even more relevant to today than with the addition of the pandemic. And I think it's a reminder that during tough times, New York in the snow still inspires. We had a snowy winter this past winter, for what it's worth. Now, Elizabeth, I want to turn to you because it's worth noting that it is remarkably rare for Hassan paintings to come to market, especially one as significant and in such good condition as this one. So can you tell us what makes this sale so exciting from your perspective?
Thanks, Sarah. This is a hugely exciting moment for Sotheby's and for Childe Hassam. I think it's been mentioned a couple of times that there are approximately 30 paintings in Hassam's celebrated series of flag paintings. Most of them already belong to the permanent collections of prominent institutions throughout the United States. So it's incredibly rare for one of them to come to market. In fact, the last time an example from the series appeared at auction was over 20 years ago, when Flagg's Afternoon on the Avenue sold in 1998 for almost $8 million. So it's been a long time since then. The estimate that we have recommended for Flags on 57th Street winter 1918 is $12 to $18 million. So it's the highest estimate ever been placed on a work by Childe Hassam at auction. And it really reflects the importance of the picture and its real quality.
Now, we see this in both of these paintings, a sense of location being so vitally important to these. David and Elizabeth, what can you say about the centrality of New York to Hassam's flag series? I'll start with you, Elizabeth.
I really kind of see them as almost love letters to the city. Hassam began to paint them fairly soon after he returned to New York from living elsewhere, and he found the city just remarkably changed in his absence. It had grown enormously, it had rapidly industrialized, and just created this environment that was sort of defined by constant activity and crowds of people and this frenetic, almost palpable sense of energy that I think is really captured in each and every one of the flag paintings.
David?
Well, Hassan came out of what was called the City Beautiful movement, which was an idea that cities should be full of open space and classically oriented architecture, and that it would uplift the spirits and the souls of the people within it. And contrasting to that, to the City Beautiful movement in the early 20th century was the Ashcan school of painting that embraced the darkness, grittiness, bustling rhythm of the city. And Hassan starts off, even with the flag paintings, he's opposed to that view. He wants the city to be pristine and beautiful and genteel. But as the war continues and as his thinking develops, I think he becomes more of a Ashcan school painter. And with our painting, the flags on West 57th Street, or on 57th Street, he's embracing what I might call a Whitman-esque vision of New York, with difference and movement and obstacles, snow and light and all these combinations of things. Yes, it becomes a metaphor for how American troops are doing during the war, but it's also, for all of that, as Elizabeth said, it's a love letter to New York. But it's new terms for Hassan. He's seen the city with a more open attitude toward its diversity than I think he experienced at the beginning of the series.
Now, we've mentioned Impressionism already. I brought up Monet, and as did you, David, but it is important to remember that Hassan's importance lies not only in his role as an important American artist, but also his standing, particularly as a pioneer of American Impressionism. David, let's go into the topic of Impressionism in Hassan's work a little bit. Where do you see that influence?
Well, if you look at it, Monet famously did serial paintings of haystacks and water lilies and cathedral fronts and flags. And Hassan knew Monet did several flag paintings, and this is an example of one, not of a Bastille Day celebration, but of a national celebration in Paris. And I think that's what initially gave Hassan the idea of doing a similar motif back in New York. But Hassan, as much as he loved Impressionism and was so inspired by its efforts to show modern life in a modern way, he nonetheless was more conservative and more sort of control-oriented than Monet was. If you compare the two images, the Monet, the flags become this fantasia of red, white, and blue, and the pedestrians are just little flickers of brushstrokes. It depersonalizes the city and turns the city, this one view out at Monet's window, into just a pastiche of different colors all swirled together. Whereas you compare it to Hassan, the flags are clearly defined. There's a finite amount of them. The city is, remember, he was an illustrator to begin with, so it's highly legible. So he didn't approve of the illegibility, as it might have been seen at the time, of Monet's work, and wanted something that, so he's an impressionist, but an impressionist who always is insistent on structure and architecture and sort of clear recessions into the background.
Well, on staying on the subject of Impressionism, I think it's really worth noting that this painting is not being offered in a sale of American art, in Sotheby's American art category sale. It's being offered in the Impressionist and Modern Art evening sale. And works by American Impressions are usually in that American art category. Elizabeth, is this a source of tension at the auction house in terms of, you know, where do we put things, and why are we seeing this in the Imp Mod sale?
You know, I think it's part of a broader reconsideration of the traditional collecting categories, and part of a concerted effort to really break down those silos, because it's not, perhaps it once was, but it's not really the way that people really collect art anymore. And I think, you know, also it's impossible to talk about American Impressionism without talking about French Impressionism. And this is such an important American painting, but it really also is a masterpiece of Impressionism. And so to that end, we wanted to give it the most elevated sale context possible to really underscore that importance, you know, at every aspect of the sale.
Now, moving on all the way from 1918 to 2020, let's talk about unFlagging, an exhibition at Ballroom Marfa in Marfa, Texas, curated by Daisy Nam. And first, we're going to watch a short video clip.
Seconds.
And I think in contemporary society, flags are still really potent subjects and objects. And so we had invited a group of 8 artists to reconsider the flag. I think a lot of times flags can communicate beliefs and values of a group and in public space and disguise, as David so beautifully talked about with Hassam's paintings. And I think that the contemporary artists that we chose were really interested in kind of reconsidering how flags perform. So what are the symbols that they represent? What are the ideologies, and how do the ideas shift, and how do the symbols shift with those ideas? And can new meanings be created? So just a little bit of context. The show was opened in October, and that was right before the elections. It was still during mass protests, such as Black Lives Matter. There was a lot of reconsideration of status quo just being challenged, including our symbols and what those symbols mean to us, and how those symbols can kind of change, and how can they be produced. And so I think, you know, for example, the Mississippi flag at that time was being reconsidered because a lot of the citizens in Mississippi thought that it represented white supremacy symbols like the Confederate flag. So the lawmakers at that time then, you know, petitioned to redesign that flag. So I think that was a really important moment and contextual moment that was a marker for us to invite these artists, these 8 artists, to the show.
And just as we saw, you know, how inextricable the context of New York is really to Hassam's painting, we really have to talk about the context here of Marfa, Texas, down near the US-Mexico border.
Yeah, a lot of the artists thought of the site, the specific site, and we're located in far west Texas, right near the US and Mexican border. And many people know that in this region for many generations, the border was very fluid, and you know, the kind of demarcation was this river, the Rio Grande. But as we know, with rivers and with the natural elements, they shift, and people kind of moved more fluidly in and out of these spaces. But you know, with our political situation, those kind of moving demarcations were actually more fortified and constructed and set solid, i.e. the wall. And so, you know, as the artists are thinking about the borders now being fixed and symbols being fixed, how can we kind of change the idea of fixity, and how can we instead create ideas that are in flux and can move ideas and people that can move in and out of spaces. So I think that was a really big part of how the artists imagined their flags performing in this space in Marfa, Texas.
Well, speaking of reimagining things, let's look at Byron Kim, the artist Byron Kim, and the flag that he created, which I think is such a fascinating look at the sort of abstract construct of nationality. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, for Byron Kim's flag, instead of a flag representing something, it almost disappears into the sky. And so he, in his practice, is known as a painter and as an abstract painter. And his kind of reference points are flags in American art history, or, for example, Jasper Johns, or as we just talked about, Hassan. And so he's kind of using that as his anchor point. And for his iteration in Marfa, he is, you can see that the picture here where you can see that the flag just disappears or attempts to disappear into the sky. How he created this flag and fabricated this flag was to work with a collective in Juarez in Mexico, just 3 hours north of us. And that collective used indigo and on linen, so natural fabric and natural materials, and using indigo tried to match that indigo to the sky in Juarez, and then install it here where the indigo and the blue tries to match the sky in Marfa, Texas. And throughout the time of the exhibition, it really transforms, and the sun kind of bleaches it out, and it eventually faded to white, and you can see that in this image. And of course, we know that the white flags references surrender. So it's a little bit of, challenging these ideas of fixed claims of territory, let's say, and kind of giving into those ideas that are demarcating these ideas. Another flag that
yeah, let's move on. We have a very, very different approach from Jeffrey Gibson. Let's look at that.
So with Jeffrey Gibson's flags, you see two lone stars, and they never quite touch, but as the wind moves, they are almost blending into each other and almost dancing with each other. But as many people know, the Lone Star State of Texas, and people are really proud of the flag that represents this state. And the Lone Star State in Texas has a singular star, the Lone Star, and white and blue stripes, and it represents the unity for God, state, and country. And of course, Jeffrey Gibson, who is Indigenous, in some ways, his flag can question, well, whose country is this country? How did one come to this country? Who has claims to this land? And so instead of using the Texas Lone Star, he uses the Lone Star that is central to his Indigenous community, which are the Lone Stars of the quilts. Many Indigenous, especially women, quilters would quilt these really elaborate 8-pointed stars, and they had really colorful patterns, very complex coloring. And he shared with me, as a young boy, he would watch his grandmothers make these really elaborate Lone Star quilts. And another kind of entry point, Jeffrey Gibson also studied painting, and he was introduced to Western art history, the likes of, let's say, Albers and geometric abstraction and the use of colors through the lens of Albers. But, in his own personal history, his grandmother's quilts were actually how he learned of modern or geometric abstraction. So it's a different entry point into how we learn of these histories as well.
And finally, we have a flag designed by Namat Sabar. What's the meaning behind this very unique design?
For Nama Sabar's beautiful flag, it almost looks like a sail, and where we expect to see the flag is actually a cutout, a rectangular cutout, and we see the skies instead. And we see empty space. And so this flag was really interesting because you could see it from afar. there. But you could also, when you get closer into the courtyard, you have a different, really intimate experience. And there you'll see a detailed shot. But the closer you get, the more you see the details. And you would see that the flag is made of strips, white strips that are connected with colored threading. And the color of the thread represents the LGBTQ pride flag colors. And, in her kind of interpretation of this flag, she's questioning the really iconic pride flag, and now we have the Pride Progress flag that is LGBTQIA+. And so these kind of shifting of the shifting of the visual design of flags in our everyday lives, and how that changes, and how identity can't really be captured sometimes can't be captured and solidified in these types of designs. And so how can we make new designs that challenge that fixity?
Now, Daisy, you mentioned Jasper Johns in there when you were talking about Byron Kim.
Yeah.
And, I just for our audience, we could talk about flags and art all day. There's an incredible number of artworks that artists have made that reference flags, that include flags, that play with the concept of flags. One of the most iconic ones, as we're moving forward from Hassam to Daisy's show, is Jasper Johns's Three Flags, which I believe is in the Whitney Museum. Yes, there we go. And throughout history, the image of the flag and its symbolic power have captured the imagination of artists. In this particular case, Johns is seeing it with a certain amount of ironic detachment that was characteristic of his time, and also in its way particular to him. It's worth saying that Johns sort of said of this painting that he realized that the flag was something that was seen and not looked at, not examined. And he remarked that this painting allowed him to go beyond the limits of the flag and to have different canvas space. He's, of course, layering it. I'd love to hear what our panelists think about this iconic example. David, let's start with you.
Well, I would like to contextualize this in two different ways. One is politically, in the height of the Cold War, Johns is being ironic about, as we've already discussed, the symbol of America, the iconic symbol of America, the flag. Here he's multiplying it. Johns was a gay artist and sort of a dissenter he's from the South, and he was a dissenter from the ultra patriotism of his Southern heritage. And so by multiplying the flag and fragmenting the flag and superimposing the flag, he's already questioning or challenging the traditional straightforward notion of the flag and what democracy and the United States means. But the second context is an art world context. In the early 50s, without question, the dominant art critic was Clement Greenberg, who insisted on at least two, who championed abstract expressionism and said art should be serious, art should be non-figurative or non-representational, and painting should always aspire to flatness, because a canvas is flat, and anything that isn't flat, that looks to have dimension or depth to it, is a falsification of what the object really is. Well, Johns challenges all those things. He's taking the flag, which was representational. Has a narrative to it. He's taking nothing is flatter than a flag. I mean, even a canvas with paint on it is not as flat as an American flag. Here he makes the illusion of one flag superimposed on the other. There's a sense of depth here. Particularly, he's using encaustic, he's using wax to give it a sculptural formation. And he's being humorous. He's not being dead serious. He's being playful. He's a precursor to pop art, several years before pop art. So I see this painting as doubly sort of tweaking of Eisenhower, of flipping off of Eisenhower America and a flipping off of Clement Greenberg and self-serious abstract expressionism.
Daisy, can you talk about the kind of precedent like this sets for some of the artists you're working with?
Yeah, as I mentioned with someone like Byron Kim, he is taking that cue that Jasper Johns is presenting in this work and the kind of relationship with the image as object, as ground, and that kind of flattening and kind of reimagining, well, how could I do this with sky blue flag, and kind of making taking that cue and creating something different that does kind of deconstruct. And I think a political context for Byron Kim is also, the flag at the specific border space, borderlands. The flag, of course, is in the sky, and the skies are not divided. The land may be divided because of the politics of the two countries, but the sky is the same, essentially.
Now, going from Jasper Johns, we're going to go a little bit back in time to a fascinating and very different example of the use of the flag. Norman Rockwell uses the Japanese flag to lend a sense of gravity to this piece called Homecoming Marine. David, I wanted you to say a few things about this. Why are flags so tightly linked to warfare? And also, I feel like there's a fascinating story about Clement Greenberg that you mentioned at one point.
Oh. Yeah, well, first of all, one of the keys to understanding this painting is a newspaper clipping at the upper right-hand corner that shows a young man with his Marine hat on, and it says, "Garage Man, a hero." And the idea is that this is some kid who worked in a car garage, and he went off to war, and now he's come back, and everybody, all the older men and the younger boys, they're all enthralled by him. He's a rock star, and he's holding in his hand the flag of the rising sun, the Japanese flag, which he's captured. So it's a sort of a fantasy of male triumph, where the humble garage boy is now the hero of all these people. But I think it's interesting that it's called Homecoming Marine, that Rockwell is offering a sort of humility here, because the man isn't boasting. He's not throwing the flag or tearing it apart. He's kind of humbly holding it in his hands. So I think what Rockwell, my interpretation of this is Rockwell is modeling, it was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. I think he's modeling an anti-triumphal attitude that, we shouldn't be boasting and beating our chests at conquering the enemy, but rather have this sort of quiet humility about it. Now, Norman Rockwell is somebody who in the 50s, people who were progressive in art mocked Rockwell and thought he was the epitome of kitsch and backward-looking, backward-thinking art. But as it turns out, Alex Nemroff, in his brilliant new biography of Helen Frankenthaler, tells a story that Frankenthaler and Greenberg, who were lovers, were vacationing in the Berkshire Mountains in the early 50s. And Greenberg one day says, "Let's go visit Norman Rockwell. He's nearby in Stockbridge, Mass." So they made an appointment to see Rockwell. And Greenberg said to Rockwell, "I've loved your art ever since I was a kid. It's what made me want to become an art critic and made me want to become a painter. And I just have to tell you that." And Rockwell just humbly said, "Well, I hope your taste has evolved since then."
I think that's amazing. Let's just, in the same vein, really quickly look at one of the most iconic images of the flag in the 20th century. This is raising the flag on Iwo Jima, an image that I'm sure many of our audience recognizes. David, just a few words about this.
Well, it's a powerful icon, not simply because it shows the triumph of the raising of the American flag in enemy territory at the conclusion of the war, but also graphically, visually, it's just so dynamic with that flagpole at a counter diagonal to, instead of starting left to right, it sort of starts in the lower right and goes upward. And you see these men heroically coming together to install the flag in the territory. So you could look at it as an image of imperialistic triumph or anti-imperialistic because it's against the Japanese, but it's really also something about aspiration. The men in the background are reaching out up to hold the flag and they're not quite touching it. And so I think there's a sense here. And go back to Daisy's theme of the undifferentiated sky. It's a flag as a part of the sky, and these people are reaching up to the sky. So I think I'm going maybe too quickly for an analysis, but what I'm trying to say is that it has lodged itself in American consciousness, worldwide consciousness, because it is such a powerfully visually dynamic image of a flag in a sky and men aspiring toward that sky.
Now, I want to move on. I think we would be doing this audience a disservice if we didn't mention that Sotheby's has another spectacular painting that involves a flag in a very prominent way, also coming up for sale this season. And I say this in all earnestness. This is not a plug for Sotheby's. I love Robert Colescott. I think he's one of the great artists of the 20th century, right now being rediscovered. I'm just going to put in a little footnote here. When I was in college, I had this terrific professor, Robert Rosenblum, who was also a curator at the Guggenheim. And one time my house sat for him, and he had a terrific Robert Colescott painting in his house, and I was obsessed with it. So I'm a huge Robert Colescott fan. So I just want to establish that. Now, in this painting, what you're seeing is Colescott, who was African American, reimagining a very famous, iconic scene here. Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about this painting.
Well, it's interesting to note that several of the most iconic images in American culture feature images of the American flag. And of course, you can't have that conversation without mentioning Emanuel Leutze's Washington Crossing the Delaware, which is located at the Met, just a few miles from where I'm sitting now. So in his work, Robert Colescott, the work is called Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware. He's taking this image that is just so pervasively known in pop culture and using it to call into question who and what has traditionally been accepted in the canon of Western art history.
And you can see that his title includes a page from an American history textbook, which I think is quite significant. Daisy, because this is 1975, this is edging towards contemporary territory and your contemporary artist. Can you say a little bit about what Colescott's doing here?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what Elizabeth was saying, these kind of symbols of freedom and, contemporary artists kind of reimagining, well, is this an act of freedom? Is it not an act of maybe colonization or occupation? And so someone like Jeffrey Gibson, one could read that flag as questioning those same things, as an Indigenous artist. And how does one get claims to a land? And what are the symbols of freedom that we need to re-examine and the histories that go with that?
Right. And I just want to come back to Elizabeth for one second before we open up for questions. Elizabeth, I can't help but note the estimate on that painting, 9.5 million. Again, not a plug for Sotheby's. And the monetary value of a painting is not synonymous with its value in other ways. But this is significant because, to have an estimate like this on a piece by an artist like Colescott, that's meaningful, don't you think?
Absolutely. And it's not dissimilar to the estimate on the HASM, to bring it back to flags on 57th Street. I mean, an estimate can be used to indicate the significance and the quality of a picture. And I think that is what's happening in the case of both of these works.
And with that, we're going to move over to some audience questions. We have one that just came in. And I think I'll hand this to David first, but anyone else can have a shot at it as well. Why do you think flags hold such importance in American society in contrast to other countries? We actually talked a little bit about this earlier.
Well, I think the United States, the very term that we gave our nation, is about unity, e pluribus unum, of bringing people together. And so from the start, there's been an importance attached to symbolism, some sort of mental construct that people can share and be, to go back to the Lloyds of George Washington crossing the Delaware, we're all in the same boat together, the theory is, and we need something that is a prize that we can all put our eyes onto. And I think the flag, for a nation that prides itself or used to pride itself in its diversity, the flag becomes a perfect way of, the Statue of Liberty is another example of that, some image that everybody can share a reverence for. And so I think that's why the flag had a greater significance for Americans than it did for many European nations or other nations in other parts of the world.
Unfortunately, we don't have anyone from Europe here to handle that. I think it's worth mentioning, and we didn't talk about this during our talk, that the flag, of course, has also been used, in a much more direct way than John's is doing to be critical of this country's policies. For instance, during the Vietnam War, you saw the flag being used in certain different ways to criticize what the country was doing in its involvement there. We have another.
Let me add, because that does remind me. Yeah, even back in World War I, people protested the war by burning the flag or stomping on the flag. So it didn't originate with Vietnam War. It already had precedents during the First World War until very strict censorship laws were enforced, and then, even though there was still no flag burning law, anti-desecration law on the books, people were thrown in jail for having desecrated the flag. But the laws have always run into problems because freedom of speech allowed, First Amendment rights give people, if you burn a flag in protest against what the government's doing, that is a free expression. And to say you can't burn the flag to express your feelings contradicts the First Amendment. So there's been many legal battles over the decades over what are people allowed to do with or without the flag.
And for those of you listening, an artwork that you can look at where the artist was really testing those ideas and laws, and is Dred Scott made a piece called "The Correct Way to Display an American Flag," it's actually quite controversial at the time it was made. A question for you, Daisy, from the audience: were all the artists involved in the Ballroom Marfa exhibition American? How did their different nationalities affect their work?
That's a really good question. Not everyone was American. In that little video piece you saw, there was a Chilean artist, Cecilia Vicuña. But an artist that I did speak about, Nama Sabar, for example, lives in the US, but is actually Israeli. And so in her home country, there is another kind of complication and really politicized situation between Israel and Palestine. So I think a lot of the artists who weren't American could use some of their experience in their home countries to create a flag for the site in Marfa, Texas.
And that's very interesting. It's obviously such a loaded place near the border there. What did the speakers think of Rauschenberg's use of flags? Rauschenberg, of course, very close with John's. David, do you want to take that one?
Well, I think Rauschenberg is coming from a collage aesthetic, and he's thinking about taking images from everyday life, from the visual culture of the present, and juxtaposing them in piquant ways that force us to make new connections. I mean, collage derives in a sense from Sergei Eisenstein's montage of taking different objects together and dialectically crashing them against one another. And I think that Rauschenberg does that very beautifully when he uses the flag as well as other symbols of pop art and pop culture.
Now, it looks like we are actually running out of time. If there aren't any more questions, which of course you can submit, we have one more question on the way. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, going back to the whole tenor of our discussion about flags, I want to remind people that Child Hassam's painting, it's not either like an on and off thing. You either love the flag and you desire that painting, or you're anti-nationalist and anti-patriotism, and therefore you reject the painting. To my eyes, it is spectacularly modern, exciting, visually stimulating, and politically stimulating work of art. So I just didn't want that to get lost in the sense of the other ways the flags have been treated. I think this is really a standout painting in that tradition of the use of the flag as a uber symbol of various concepts of modern life.
Well, to mention something very a little different. I mean, we spoke earlier about the how Hassam became very fond of New York after moving here, and another artist who that is the case with is of course Piet Mondrian, who made Broadway Boogie Woogies. It's a very different kind of aerial view of the city, but similar in that in their ways. I think both paintings are odes to the city, no matter what the mood might be.
That's a great comparison. I mean, because again, as you look at this, you see the architecture. Mondrian retains architecture, even though he drops away the ephemera and just gets to structure. This is a very structured painting, but similarly to Broadway Boogie Woogie, it's pulsating and rhythmic and bouncing around. And so I've talked about the architecture and the structure of this, but it's a highly rhythmic, musical. It's the time of Gershwin. There's a kind of Rhapsody in Blue quality about this that I think makes it effervescent.
Now, because of course we can't be here with the painting, Elizabeth, I would love for you to just quickly tell us about the surface of this painting. Is there a lot? Is it a thickly painted surface? I just would love to get a better sense for the actual object before we leave our audience.
Well, it's worth coming to see it at Sotheby's starting tomorrow if you can, if you live in New York. But it is really an exceptionally beautiful painting in person with an exquisite surface. You really see every brushstroke that Hassam places on the canvas. It's just been beautifully preserved. The painting is in strikingly pristine condition, which we don't always see with paintings that were painted over 100 years ago. But I really can't stress this enough. Standing in front of it is a different experience, and one that is worth making the trip to the Upper East Side for.
Just one other quick question, because our audience can't tell this. About how large is this painting?
It is about 40 inches high, a little less. So it has a striking presence on the wall.
Now, one more question, and we're going to go kind of fast. This is for all the speakers. Can you quickly say, what's your favorite part of this painting? This is from our audience.
I can start. My favorite part of the painting is the palette. And again, when you stand in front of it, it really gives you an appreciation for these almost electric colors that he uses, particularly in the upper register of the painting. I mean, it's vibrant yellow and these oranges, and there's just so much kind of nuance of color that is really quite beautiful.
Yeah, I would add, when I stand in front of it, I'm reminded of de Kooning. You zero in on the street and the stroke work and how the flag, the strokes that are used for the flag, and it's just so rich, such a sensuous, delicious painting in that term. It's very something you don't get from seeing it on screen, is the sort of the fullness of each brushstroke, the resonance of each brushstroke, and the color variegation within them.
Daisy?
I think for me, something that struck me that David said was what the flags evoke. I mean, the heaviness, the historical context of, the war going on, and the kind of the flags in snow, and they're not as vibrant or moving in the same way as some of the other paintings, but they're kind of dragging down, and the weightiness of that really struck me, and you could really see that in all the flags that he presents here.
I'm going to go ahead and say something that I cannot be completely assured of, because I, full disclosure, have not seen this painting in person yet. But I have a feeling that in the lower left, you have that effect, which is so great with some painters, of the snow becoming synonymous with paint.
Yes.
And I think that's really terrific. And I also like the way he captures that snow in New York is never just snow. It is snow and slush and a little bit of dirt, and he's gone in there and indicated that way, and indicated that in a way that's very nuanced.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, I am going to thank all of you for this brilliant discussion. And I am going to also thank Intelligence Squared for their help in putting all of this together. They're really terrific. And just a little note to remind you, Sotheby's is selling Flags on 57th Street, Winter 1918 by Childe Hassam in New York on May 12th at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. For those of you who are interested in buying this, don't forget that. For more information, visit Sotheby's.com or the Sotheby's app. I hope you enjoyed watching, and thank you to everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.